If I got on Twitter and wrote, "The United States and Canada are brothers," what would that mean? What would I be trying to say? Should you think about your relationship with your own brother or sibling or cousin or whoever and take that as the model? Should you try to figure out what heritage the two countries have in common? Maybe I'm talking about what the two countries have in common today. It's all kind of up in the air. And how you decide what I mean also depends on what's available to you and what's important to you. It might help to know me personally. If you don't have that pleasure, you might decide all that's important is understanding the values of someone in my position. Or not at all. Maybe you have an agenda and you're ready to use the words of a sage like me to firm up your own arguments. Now imagine trying to decide what I mean if I were talking about countries that no longer exist and haven't existed for millennia. Can you guess where I'm going? Yup, you're in luck. You don't have to decide. I'm here to tell you all about why the ancient Chinese states of Lu and Wey were brothers. Exploring the Analects, Episode 20, Passage 13.7, Relative Dysfunction. Hey folks, this is Elliot Bernstein. Thanks for joining me for Episode 20 of Exploring the Analects. In this episode, we'll be covering Passage 13.7 of the Analects, a 7-character phrase focused on the politics of the states of Lu and Wey, plus the Confucian commentarial tradition and the great synthesizer Zhu Xi. As always, I'll read the passage in Chinese and English, explain the ideas behind it, and provide some historical context. Then I'll analyze the language found in the passage as a way to learn new words and phrases in classical Chinese and in modern Mandarin. If you're watching on YouTube, be sure to hit that subscribe button. No matter how you follow, I always appreciate likes and shares. As always, you can also follow along with the episode guide on analects.net, where you'll find all the Chinese terms in this episode, as well as a newly revamped full text of the Analects. All right, let's get started. First, I'll read the passage in a modern Mandarin pronunciation, followed by my English translation. 13.7 子曰鲁卫之政兄弟也 The master said, politically, the states of Lu and Wey are brothers. This is an admittedly cryptic passage, which is why we're going to spend a lot of this episode focused on interpretation and the commentarial tradition. These interpretations come to us care of Han-dynasty scholar Bao Xian, whose work during the 1st century CE remained influential for millennia, and the Song-dynasty Zhu Xi, also known as Su Dongpo, one of China's most famous poets and an influential scholar himself, who lived during the 11th century. These differing interpretations, although never truly irreconcilable in their claims, were later compiled in the 12th century by the great synthesizer himself, Zhu Xi. If there's one point of inflection for practically all scholarship on the Analects, it's the work of Zhu Xi, whose interpretations became canonical and were not only memorized for centuries by the Chinese as part of the core education curriculum, but also served as the basis for Europe's understanding of Confucianism through the likes of Matteo Ricci and James Legge. So let's kick things off and put these two interpretations right up front. The first century interpretation by Bao Xian goes something like this. Lu was the fief of the Duke of Zhou. Wey was the fief of Kang Shu. Since the Duke of Zhou and Kang Shu were brothers, and Kang Shu was on good terms with the Duke of Zhou, the governments of their states were also like brothers. Did you get that? Short story is, two guys, they were brothers, and they were close. They were each granted a fiefdom, so their states had similar styles of government. Seems reasonable enough. The second interpretation is the 11th century interpretation by Zhu Xi. Here it goes. In Wei's government, the father was no father, and the son no son. In Lu's government, the ruler was no ruler, and the minister no minister. In the end, Duke Ai of Lu fled to Zhu and died in Yue. Duke Zhou of Wey fled and likewise died in Yue. Their fates were as close as this. The story here is that both had dysfunctional governments at the time that Confucius made his comments. In each state, the ruler ended up fleeing due to political instability, and they ended up dying far away in the kingdom of Yue. Is only one of these right? Well, we really don't know. Maybe neither of them is right. There's likely no way to be sure without some miraculous archaeological discovery of a new primary source. But they're both highly plausible, and they're not exactly mutually exclusive. So within a century of the second interpretation, Zhu Xi had ended up sticking them together. We'll get to that part, as well as the other interpretations, a bit later. First, let's dig into the history behind the earlier interpretation, the one about the brothers. You'll need a little bit of historical context about the Zhou dynasty in general, and the spring and autumn period specifically, to fully get it. I cover this in multiple other episodes, so I'll try to keep this brief. The Zhou was a roughly 8th century period from 1046 to 256 BCE. The kingdom was centered on the North China Plain and ruled by the House of Ji. At the start, the Zhou kings employed a vassalage system that granted some autonomy to local rulers over internal states, while those rulers recognized the Zhou king as the highest authority. The Zhou kings made over 100 grants of this type. Many were tiny and obscure, while others, like the states of Lu and Wey, that we're discussing in this episode, appear frequently in various historical records, including the Analects. In 770 BCE, after several hundred years of this vassalage system, the original Zhou capital was sacked by the nomadic Quanrong people in collaboration with one of their very own vassals, the Marquis of Shang. And the royal court was forced to flee east. That event marked the start of the Eastern Zhou, as well as the beginning of the spring and autumn period, the chaotic period during which Confucius was born. Now, Confucius was born in the state of Lu, an area close to China's east coast, roughly where Shandong province is today. Among Lu's neighbors was the state of Wei to the west. As a smaller and weaker state, Wei had fallen under the vassalage of the powerful state of Jin. Its borders shifted quite a bit, but they generally fell within what is now the province of Henan. There's a lot to know about these two states, and I cover some of the more scandalous politics in episode 12, hiding behind a smile, if you're interested in hearing more. To understand the early interpretation of this passage, the one about the two founding brothers, what you really need to know is not the events that occurred during Confucius's lifetime, but what happened centuries earlier when the states were created. The first king of the Zhou dynasty, King Wu, didn't live long following his conquest of the previous Shang dynasty. After just 3 years, he passed away, leaving his teenage son to lead the newly established dynasty in a highly unstable political atmosphere. Fortunately, the new king, King Chang, had a strong relationship with one of his father's younger brothers. This uncle served as a regent during the first 8 years of King Chang's reign. He became known as Zhou Gong, or the Duke of Zhou, and is praised as the great stabilizing force during those early years for fending off rebellions by jealous relatives, resettling populations of the conquered Shang, and legitimizing Zhou rule by formalizing the doctrine of Tianming, or the mandate of heaven. Just like with the states of Lu and Wey, there's so much to say about the Duke of Zhou, from his influence during the early Zhou to just how much Confucius revered him, to how he's remembered in Chinese history in general. But in the interest of keeping this episode focused, those details have to come another time. Anyway, one way that the Duke of Zhou and the young King Chang worked to stabilize the new kingdom was through the type of enfeoffments I mentioned earlier. These giant land grants didn't go to just anyone. Most were given to close trusted relatives of the king, and among the first to be granted was Confucius's home state of Lu, which went to the Duke of Zhou's oldest son. Another one of these grants went to the youngest of the Duke of Zhou's brother, known as Kang Shu. That grant was the state of Wei. So there was literal brotherhood connecting the founder of one state and the father of the founder of the other. Now, it may have occurred to you that this doesn't necessarily explain why they were brothers politically. And the same thing occurred to an 18th century commentator who tried to explain the statements using details from one of the earliest and most influential narratives of Chinese history, the Zhuo Zhuan, the Zhuo commentary on the Spring and Autumn Annals. Describing the relationship among the 8 brothers of King Wu, he wrote, "The Duke of Zhou and Kang Shu were the most harmonious with each other." So the master's statement here is backed up by history. He then went on to describe the governmental philosophies of the two states, both of which read very much like methods Confucius himself would have approved of and found to be compatible with one another. 薄秦之政，亲亲尊尊，康叔之政，明德慎法. The Duke of Zhou's son, Bo Qin, governed in Lu with policies of valuing kinship and honoring the venerable. Kang Shu governed in Wei with the policy of illuminating virtue and being heedful in meting out punishment. I'm going to digress here a little bit from the commentaries to point out another way that the states of Lu and Wei were brotherly. They were both states with large populations of loyalists from the previous Shang dynasty. In the case of Wei, not only was the original Shang capital within its borders, the new Zhou rulers sent many members of the Shang royal clan back to that area to be resettled. In the case of Lu, other Shang clans, including groups of artisans, were sent to that state. Some historical sources claim that this migration of Shang clans was how Confucius's own family arrived in Lu. Given the large number of Shang in each state, the two government policies mentioned above make sense. The government of Lu may have been telling its Shang residents, of course you're going to stay close to your family, but remember who is the new authority. While the government of Wei may have been telling the royal Shang clan, we won't punish you without reason, and we will respect your customs if we find them to be virtuous. Well, that's about it for the first interpretation, so let's move on to the second. Remember, this one is about how these two states were similar in how dysfunctional their governments and politics were. The quote we read earlier was, "In Wei's government, the father was no father, and the son was no son. In Lu's government, the ruler was no ruler, and the minister no minister. In the end, Duke Ai of Lu fled to Zhu and died in Yue. Duke Zhou of Wei fled and likewise died in Yue. Their fates were as close as this." First off, this commentary is a reference to passage 12.11, one of the better-known passages of the Analects that states, "Let the ruler be the ruler, the minister be a minister, the father be a father, and the son be a son." Confucius considered these roles and relationships to all be the basis for good government, since he saw relationships between those who govern and their subjects as an extension of relationships between family members. So fathers and sons who maintained a harmonious relationship would be a microcosm for rulers and ministers who do the same. But the most important father-son relationship in the state of Wei was not harmonious at all. As we covered in episode 12, Duke Ling of Wei had a son named Kwai Koi, who was crown prince. Duke Ling's wife, Nanzi, was having a very public affair with a literal Prince Charming named Song Chao, and Kwai Koi was extremely embarrassed and so plotted but failed to kill her. Kwai Koi then fled to Wei, and Nanzi installed Kwai Koi's own son as Duke Chu, which of course Kwai Koi saw as his chance to claim the title he saw as rightfully his. After 2 attempts, Kwai Koi succeeded in deposing his son, and a little side note, Confucius's warrior disciple Zhu Lu was killed in this coup. Kwai Koi was so unpopular as duke that even his own ministers tried to overthrow him. Duke Chu eventually regained power, but not all went well. He was deposed by his own uncle and fled to the southern kingdom of Yue, where he eventually died. So hey, if you ever think your own family's got issues, just remember these fine folks. Now, as for the rulers who aren't rulers and ministers who aren't ministers, that's about Confucius's home state of Lu. I've mentioned the powerful San Huan before. These were 3 families who all descended from the Duke Huan, who had reigned some 200 years earlier. The heads of these families officially acted as ministers for the Duke of Zhou. They were much wealthier than the Duke and maintained their own walled cities and military forces within the state, so nearly all decision-making power in the state actually resided with them. The Duke of Zhou, later in Confucius's life, Duke Ai, actually had no military of his own, but he desired to strip the families of their power. And that's about all you need to know to understand ministers who aren't ministers and rulers who aren't rulers. There's a bit more to the story that explains the part about how they both died in Yue. We just covered how Duke Chu ended up there. Duke Ai did as well. He was the 3rd generation of Lu rulers to attempt to wrestle power back from the San Huan. His grandfather had attempted a military action, His father, Duke Ding, had attempted political subterfuge along with Confucius, and his attempt would be through a secret alliance. The kingdom of Yue was never really a Zhou vassal. They were a confederacy of tribes far to the south of the Zhou homeland that claimed descent from the already ancient and semi-mythical Xia-dynasty. The ruler at that time, King Goujian, had recently vanquished the other great southern power, the state of Wu, to become the last of the spring and autumn period's hegemons. One notable tidbit about King Goujian is that one of his swords that's mentioned in historical sources was actually recovered in 1965, still sharp and in excellent condition. And you can now see this sword at the Hubei Provincial Museum. I'll post a picture in the episode guide. It's quite a sight. Anyway, most of the Zhou vassals considered Yue people to be at least semi-barbaric and were suspicious of their strange styles of writing, unfamiliar artistic motifs, and shamanistic religious practices. Despite all that, Duke Ai recognized their military superiority. He courted them as potential military protectors and succeeded, with Yue granting him land and a secret engagement to the daughter of the crown prince. The Sanhuan found out about this engagement, and through their powerful spy network, bribed Yue officials into convincing the crown prince to call off the marriage and withdraw military support. With no powerful allies to back him up, Duke Ai was forced to flee to a neighboring state. He made his way to Yue with little to his name. From the relative safety of Yue, he plotted a return to power, but never successfully raised an army. So just like the Duke Chu, he died in exile in that strange and faraway land. That wraps up the two divergent interpretations of passage 13.7. What would happen a few generations after the 11th century interpretation by Zhu Xi is what would define the standard reading until the 20th century. Zhu Xi was born just about 30 years after the passing of Zhu Xi, during a period when Confucian thinking was being challenged by Taoist cosmology from within and Buddhist spirituality from abroad. In the intro, I called Zhu Xi the great synthesizer, not because he was a really big keyboard, but because he was able to wrangle so much of that Taoist cosmology, recognize what drew people to Buddhist spirituality, and at the same time maintain an unparalleled depth of knowledge of more than a millennium of Confucian commentary, and bring it all to bear in his greatest work, the collected commentaries on the 4 books, often called the Ji Zhu for short. That work included the commentaries on the Da Xue, the Great Learning, the Lun Yu, the Analects, the Mengzi, the Mencius, and the Zhongyong, the Doctrine of the Mean. In his commentary on the Analects, he wrote, Lu descended from the Duke of Zhou, Wey from Kang Shu, originally brother states. But at this time, both were in decline and disorder, and their governments were likewise similar, so the master sighed over them. This may look like 2 short sentences, with each one summarizing a commentator's opinion. But to allow for the possibility of both was actually somewhat radical at the time. Keep in mind that the Baoxian interpretation was not only 1,000 years older than the Zhu Xi interpretation, it was also that many years closer to the life of Confucius. The approach of Han-dynasty scholars like Baoxian was mainly to record and transmit the received wisdom surrounding these passages. the more convincingly they could draw an unbroken line from their explanations back to the master himself, the better of a job they were seen to have done. This also often meant revering the same things Confucius revered, and if he believed the cultures of Lu and Wey were superior, and that the figures of Duke of Zhou and Kang Shu were great, then it could only make sense to praise them rather than lament them. But by the time of Zhu Xi, and even more so by the time of Zhu Xi, that unbroken line was not the focus. Instead, they were looking for moral messages. What those words showed was within the heart and mind of Confucius. Zhu Xi may also have been concerned about the precarious political situation of his own time. The Song-dynasty had lost vast amounts of territory to Jurchen steppe people who established the Jin dynasty to the north. Corruption was rampant and leadership was inept. There was more than enough for him to draw parallels to from the decline into the chaos during the spring and autumn period. He still managed to recognize the plausibility of both interpretations. Seeing no conflict between them, he mentioned both. There were other tangents he chose not to include, and his interpretation became the main line of Confucian scholarship. But not right away. By the end of his life, his interpretations were officially banned as false learnings, and it was only through the efforts of following generations that he was rehabilitated. Eventually, his Zhu collected commentaries would become a requisite work for memorization by anyone studying for official appointment, who would be judged on how well they could use the content as arguments while writing essays during the imperial examinations. And that's a bit of the story of how Zhu Xi became the third most influential figure, only after Confucius and Mencius themselves, in the 2,500-year-long history of Confucianism. Now let's take a quick look at the language in this passage. 13.7 is a great place for someone just starting to dip their toes into classical Chinese waters. We start off with the name of the two spring and autumn period states, Confucius's home state of Lu and its neighbor to the west, Wey. You may think to yourself, how is this a great place to start for someone who's just starting to learn classical Chinese? You need to know the names of these historical states, and that's really specific. I'll actually admit, I had that feeling at one point too, but there's no getting around it. If you're studying French, it's kind of assumed that you're going to be learning the names of French cities like Paris, Lyon, and Marseille, and the like. Did you like my French? Anyway, it's just the same here. These names come up over and over, and so do historical figures in their titles, like Zhou Gong, the Duke of Zhou. So learning them just goes with the territory. There's one kind of fun side benefit of learning these names too. If you visit China, or if you just watch TV produced in the PRC, you'll often see license plates with some of these names on them. For example, you can still see the character Lu on license plates from the province of Shandong, and it's often shorthand for the region's culture and food. A quick note about Wey. You'll often see this character transliterated into English as W-E-Y, and you may note that's not standard pinyin. The reason people do this is to distinguish it from the Warring States period state of Wey, a much more powerful and historically consequential player during the same general era. The later Wey gets spelled with the standard W-E-I pinyin. Next up is Zhi. This is the classical Chinese equivalent of the possessive marker de. And following Zhi is zheng, government. So altogether, Luwei之政 means the politics of the states of Lu and Wey. But we can just write politically to avoid extra prepositions. Only 3 more characters to go. Xiongdi, as you probably know, means brothers, just like it does in modern Mandarin. And ye is a sentence finishing marker, one that's often used to mark a judgment or comment. So now let's put it all together. First, we state the topic at the front of the passage, the politics of the state of Lu and Wey. Then we make a comment at the end. They are brothers. All right, folks, that's it for this episode. Don't forget to check out the episode guide on analects.net and visit YouTube to subscribe and like the video edition. Join me next time for a discussion of passage 15.40, a little bit of advice on what it takes to coordinate with others. See you there.